The truck had been running for 11 minutes in the parking lot of the Chinley Family Dollar, and Dara had not gone inside. She was doing math. Not the kind with pencils and paper, the kind you did in your head at 11 o'clock at night when the heater was cycling on and off because the thermostat had a loose connection she couldn't afford to fix, and the number in her bank account was $82, and she needed to decide whether to spend $9.47 on the box of cereal and the 2 cans of soup she'd come here for, or whether to save it and figure out breakfast in the morning. The cereal would last 4 days, maybe 5 if she measured. The soup was 2 dinners, $9.47 left, $72.53. Rent was due in 11 days. She was $340 short of rent. She had a shift at Rosie's Diner tomorrow morning, starting at 5, a cleaning job at the medical office Tuesday afternoon, and she was on call for the Navajo market through the week. Best case, she cleared $190 before rent came due. Still short. She turned off the truck. She went inside and bought the cereal and the soup. She considered the small bag of apples near the door and did not buy them because apples were a luxury, and she was not in a luxury month. She stood at the register and watched the total climb on the screen, and when it stopped at $9.47, she felt nothing in particular, which was how she felt about numbers now. She had been living close to numbers for long enough that they had stopped producing emotion and simply produced information. The information was 4 days, 2 dinners. She thanked the cashier, who was a woman her own age, with the look of someone on her 3rd shift of the day, and went back to the truck. The drive home took 6 minutes. The apartment complex sat at the east edge of Chinle, 4 buildings arranged in a square around a parking area that flooded when it rained because the drainage had been inadequate since the complex was built, and the property management company had been promising to fix it for 2 years. The exterior lights on Building C had been out for 3 weeks, and the property manager had stopped responding to her texts. She parked in her usual spot and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to it tick as it cooled. The truck had 140,000 miles on it, and she had owned it for 6 of those years and knew every sound it made, the way you knew the sounds of anything you depended on and could not afford to lose. The window of their apartment on the 2nd floor was dark. Kala would be asleep. Dara had left her with Mrs. Yazzie from the apartment next door, who was 71 years old and had a television that played old westerns at a volume Dara could hear through the wall at night, and who never once asked for money in return for watching Kala during the evening shifts. She just handed the girl back at whatever hour Dara came home and said she ate good and she brushed her teeth without being asked, which was the same thing she always said, delivered with the same mild satisfaction of someone reporting a small but genuine victory. Dara climbed the stairs with the grocery bag and her work bag and her keys and her exhaustion, which was its own kind of weight that did not diminish with sleep the way other tiredness did. This kind accumulated. It had been accumulating for 3 years since Kala's father left, and the rent went from shared to sole, and the jobs went from 1 to 3, and the math went from manageable to not quite manageable, no matter how many times she recalculated it. She let herself in quietly. Mrs. Yazzie was asleep in the armchair with the television going, a black and white movie playing at low volume. She woke the moment Dara touched her shoulder, the way old women woke who had learned through experience that sleeping too deeply in an unfamiliar chair was a liability. Fully alert, already standing. She ate good, Mrs. Yazzie said. She brushed her teeth without being asked. Dara thanked her. She meant it. Gratitude was one of the things she had not run out of, which she considered a reasonable achievement given the circumstances. The apartment went quiet after the door closed. The particular quiet of a small space late at night when the person you shared it with was asleep and you were the only one awake in it. She was familiar with this quiet. She had been living inside it for 3 years, and she had learned that it was not the same as loneliness, or not only that, it was also just the sound of her own life, which was real and ongoing and contained its own gravity. She put the cereal away. She put the soup in the cabinet above the stove where she kept the canned goods arranged in a row by what they contained, because organization was the one thing that cost nothing. She peeled off her work jacket and hung it on the hook by the door and stood in the kitchen with its single overhead light and its small window that looked out on the parking lot, and she did not let herself think about the math again. She'd done enough math for one night. Calla was asleep on the floor mattress in the back room. They'd sold the bed frame in March when the transmission on the truck needed replacing. The mattress was fine. It was a good mattress, firmer than the frame had been, and Dara had explained this to her daughter with the particular care of a mother who understood that children absorbed the emotional content of explanations more than the words themselves, and Calla had said the floor is warmer anyway, because she was 7 and she was her mother's daughter, and she had already learned in the way children learn things from watching to make meaning out of constraints rather than mourning what the constraints had removed. Dara crouched beside the mattress and looked at her. Calla was sleeping on her side with one hand under her cheek and her mouth slightly open, and her mismatched socks poking out from the bottom of the blanket. The blanket was a Pendleton print that had belonged to Dara's grandmother, dark red and cream with a geometric pattern at the border. It was the only thing that had come down to Dara from the family she did not really know, and she had always understood it as the kind of inheritance that was not about money. She had Dara's nose, her own father's brow, which Dara only knew from a single photograph taken 7 years ago at a gathering neither of them had planned to attend. The combination had produced something completely its own, a face that did not resolve into either of theirs, but had simply arrived as itself, the way faces did when they were done with compromise. Dara stood. She went to the small drawer beside what served as the entryway, opened it without making noise, and reached in for the phone charger. Her fingers touched paper instead. She stopped. She pulled it out, a sheet of notebook paper folded twice the edges, uneven because Calla had torn it from the spiral binding rather than cutting it. Dara unfolded it in the light from the hallway, standing very still. At the top in Calla's careful printing Christmas list. She'd been working on her handwriting at school. The letters were more deliberate now than they'd been in September, more considered, each one standing a little more firmly on the line, still crooked at the ascenders, still hers. A warm coat. My old one has a broken zipper. Boots that fit right. My feet got bigger. A horse book with real photos. Dara read these 3 things. She noted them with the part of her mind that was always running the budget, filing them in the category of things she intended to provide and had not yet determined how. The coat was the most urgent. She had been watching for one at the trading post, the kind that came in donated and sold for almost nothing. The boots she could order from the outlet site if she had internet access and a credit card with room on it, which she currently had and was conserving with the specific discipline of someone who understood that credit was not money, and that the difference between those 2 things was the difference between surviving and not. Then she read the fourth line, "Mama to smile again." She stood in the hallway of the apartment with the paper in her hands, and she read that line 3 times, and she did not cry because she had gotten very good at not crying in the apartment because the walls were thin and Calla slept light, and because the kind of crying this line called for was not something she had time for on a Tuesday night 11 days before rent was due, and because if she started, she was not sure she would know how to stop, and she needed to be functional in the morning. She stood in the hallway. She read it a 4th time. Then she folded the list carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the dark of the bedroom, which was her half of the space behind the curtain partition they'd created when Calla was 3 and had started having opinions about privacy, and she looked at the ceiling and did the math that she had promised herself she was done doing for the night, because that was the thing about that kind of math. You could put it away and it would come back on its own, unasked. The numbers did not change by being looked at in the dark. They stayed exactly what they were. The cereal would last 4 days. The soup was 2 dinners. Rent was due in 11 days. She was $340 short. She closed her eyes. She thought about Calla's handwriting on the list, the careful letters, the broken zipper on the coat that jammed halfway up and left her daughter standing in the cold, wrestling with it every morning, the boots that had been right in September and were now a quarter size too small and were leaving marks on her daughter's feet that she'd seen when they were in the bath on Sunday. She thought about the horse book, which was easy to understand because Calla had been asking about horses since she was 4 and had shown no signs of losing interest, which was the kind of sustained devotion that deserved recognition. She thought about the last line, "Mama to smile again." She thought, "I smile." She thought, "When did I last smile and mean it?" She thought about the ceiling and the darkness and the sound of Mrs. Yazzie television through the wall, faint and steady, and she stayed with the question until it exhausted her and she fell asleep. The mail came while she was on her shift the next morning. She got home at 2:40 in the afternoon and found it in the box at the base of the stairs, the usual handful of things, an electric bill that would require a phone call she did not have time to make until Thursday, a coupon circular for a grocery store 40 miles away, a reminder card from the dentist that she filed in the category of things she would address when she could address them, and one envelope that was different from the others. It was thick, cream-colored, her name printed in black ink, neat and precise, the kind of printing that came from a label rather than a hand. No stamp, a courier label. The return address said, Holloway and Dyer Attorneys at Law, Denver, Colorado. She looked at it for a moment. She turned it over. Nothing on the back, just the envelope substantial, in her hand the paper heavier than ordinary paper. She carried it upstairs. Calla was at the after-school program until 5. Dara sat down at the kitchen table still in her work clothes, the smell of the diner still in her hair and her jacket, and she opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages printed on heavy paper that matched the envelope with a notarial seal embossed in the upper corner. She read the first paragraph twice. Then she read it a 3rd time because reading things twice was a habit she had developed with documents, and reading it a 3rd time suggested she was not processing it normally. We are contacting you in accordance with the estate of Elias Nez, a property known as Red Mesa Lodge, located in Cibola County, New Mexico, in the Chusca Mountain foothills. Elias Nez. She turned the name over in her mind the way she turned stones she found in unusual places, examining each side without yet deciding what they were. She had heard of the lodge, not often, a story that existed at the edges of the stories her generation had been told, the way certain things existed at the edges. An old lodge up in the Chuscas, people said, Navajo owned, back before anyone particularly called it that or treated it as remarkable. A place for families, Christmas mostly, closed a long time ago. Nobody went up there anymore. She had never heard the name Elias Nez in connection with any part of her own life. She read further. As the last living relative in the direct bloodline of the late Mr. Nez, you are hereby designated the sole beneficiary of his estate, including all real property, personal property, and associated rights thereto. She put the letter down on the table. She picked it up again. No debts are attached to the property. All property taxes have been paid through the end of the current fiscal year. The deed transfer has been initiated pending your formal confirmation. The property consists of the main lodge structure, outbuildings, and 12 acres of privately held land, as well as an additional parcel of 400 acres purchased by the late Mr. Nez and his father in 1955. This additional parcel carries timber and water rights, the appraised value of which is attached in Exhibit C. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange for property inspection and formal deed transfer. She read the whole letter twice more, then set it on the table and looked at it from a slight distance, as if looking from further away might clarify it. It did not clarify. The feeling in her chest was not excitement, not yet. It was something more careful than excitement. It was the feeling of a door that had been closed for a long time, making the sound that meant it might not be locked, which was different from the sound of a door opening, which was different again from the actual fact of stepping through one. She picked up her phone and dialed the number printed at the bottom of the second page. It rang 4 times. A woman answered. Holloway and Dyer, good afternoon. Dara said her name, said she had received a letter. The woman asked her to hold. While she waited, she placed the paper Christmas list on the table beside the cream-colored envelope and looked at both of them. The list in Kala's careful printing, the letter in the attorney's careful printing. 2 pieces of paper that had arrived in the same week, both asking something of her, both suggesting that something was about to change. Mama to smile again. The man who came on the line had the measured, unhurried delivery of someone who spent his professional life carrying information that altered people's situations and had learned to do so without attaching his own feelings to the delivery. He confirmed the details. He confirmed the timeline. 60 days before the trust dissolved and the property transferred to state disposition per Mr. Nez's explicit instructions and the terms of the trust as established. He said he could send the deed paperwork by standard mail, or she was welcome to come to Denver to sign in person, whichever she preferred. He said one more thing before they finished. I want to be honest with you, Ms. Nez. The lodge has been unoccupied for close to 30 years. I genuinely cannot speak to its current condition, but the land itself, both parcels, has been recently appraised. The additional 400 acres, the timber rights and the water rights associated with those acres, there has been significant commercial interest in those rights over the years. Mr. Nez declined every approach. He was very specific in the trust documents and in his personal correspondence with our office about wanting that land to remain in family hands. After she hung up, she sat for a while longer. She sat at the kitchen table in her work clothes with the smell of the diner still in her and the cream-colored envelope in front of her and the paper Christmas list beside it, and she thought about a lodge in the mountains that had been sitting empty for 30 years while someone paid the taxes on it. She thought about 400 acres and timber rights and water rights. She thought about a man named Elias Nez who had declined every commercial approach and had left instructions that were specific about family. Then she texted Rosie at the diner and asked to borrow her truck for the weekend. Rosie texted back within 2 minutes, "Keys are in my left boot by the back door. Check the oil before you go." And then, after a pause, "You okay?" Dara texted back, "Yeah, something came up." Rosie texted, "Food in your fridge." Dara looked at the kitchen. The cereal, the 2 cans of soup, half a jar of peanut butter. She texted, "I'm fine." Rosie texted, "I'll leave a box on your stairs." Dara stared at her phone for a moment. She texted, "You don't have to." Rosie texted, "I know, keys in the left boot." She went to pick up Kala from the after-school program. Her daughter came out of the building with her backpack on and her coat unzipped because she had apparently decided in October that zipping her coat was optional and had been prosecuting that position ever since. She had a drawing in one hand that she presented to Dara with the unqualified confidence of someone presenting work they considered complete. It was a horse, a large brown shape with legs that had been given considerable thought. Beside the horse, a small person. "That's you," Kala said, pointing to the small person. "You're visiting the horse." Dara looked at the drawing. She said, "Do I have a horse?" Kala said. "Not yet, but you're going to see one. That's why you're visiting." She folded the drawing and put it in Dara's jacket pocket with the authority of someone making a practical decision, and then she zipped her coat because apparently visiting horses warranted it. They got in the truck and drove home, and Dara did not say anything about the letter yet because she was still working out what there was to say. You did not tell your 7-year-old that someone had left you a lodge in the mountains until you knew what a lodge in the mountains meant in practical terms. You gathered information first. You made decisions based on what you found. That was how you operated when the margin for error was as thin as yours. She told Kala they were going on a trip that weekend, where Kala said, "Into the mountains," Dara said, "south of here, to see a building." "What kind of building?" "An old one, a lodge, like a big house." Kala thought about this. She said, "Is it ours?" Dara looked at the road. She said, "Maybe. We're going to go see." That night, after Kala was asleep and the apartment was quiet, Dara sat at the kitchen table and read the attached documents. Exhibit C was the appraisal. She read the numbers carefully, and then she read them again, and then she sat very still for a moment because the numbers were substantially larger than she had been expecting, larger than anything that had touched her life in a direct way, and she was not entirely sure how to hold a number that large when the number in her bank account was $82. She did not call anyone. There was no one to call, not at this hour, not about something she did not yet understand. She sat with it and let it be what it was, which was information she did not know how to use yet, and she went to bed. They left before dawn on Friday. Dara had packed, the way she packed for situations she did not fully understand, which was to say practically. Blankets because the lodge had been empty for 30 years and might be cold. Canned goods because she did not know how far they were from anything. A flashlight because power was uncertain. The envelope with all its documents, and the old printed map the lawyer had included with the initial mailing, a hand-drawn reproduction of the property boundaries with the approach road marked in red pen because the GPS the attorney had warned her in his cover letter would surrender somewhere on the upper elevation, and the lodge road was not indexed in any navigation system he had been able to find. Calla slept for the first hour with her head against the window and her breath fogging the glass in small rhythmic clouds. Dara drove and drank from the thermos of coffee she'd made before dawn and watched the landscape change the way it changed in this part of the country, the flat, high desert of the Chinle Valley gradually giving way to something different as they moved south and west. The mesas rose on either side of the road. The land began to gather itself into higher forms, the sky lightened by degrees from black to deep blue to the particular pale gray of early morning at altitude. When Calla woke up somewhere near the junction that took them onto the mountain road, she watched the outside for a few minutes without speaking. The juniper had appeared first, then pinon, and now, as the road switchbacked up the eastern flank of the Chuscas, the ponderosa pine stood in dense rows on either side. The snow on the ground thickened with every few hundred feet of elevation. The air coming through the vent was sharper. "There's more snow up here," Calla said. "The elevation," Dara said. Calla pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window and held it there. The GPS gave up at the junction exactly where the attorney had said it would, a small spinning indicator and then a blank map with a dot that meant you and nothing else. Dara consulted the printed map and found the road she needed, turned off the pavement onto what felt like a suggestion of a road rather than the thing itself, a narrow cut through the timber marked only by 2 wooden posts with no signage attached. She almost missed them. She stopped the truck, backed up, and turned in. The tires crunched over a surface that had not been regularly driven in a long time. The wheel ruts from years of vehicles were visible in the snowpack, partially filled in by recent snowfall, a record of use that had ended and then stayed ended. She drove slowly the trailer she wasn't pulling, conspicuously absent from her thinking now that she was on this road, and she was glad she wasn't pulling one because the road was narrow enough that she had to hold the truck precisely on the center line to avoid the embankments on either side. Then they came around the final curve. Dara stopped the truck. They sat for a moment without speaking. The lodge rose out of the trees, the way things emerge from long dreams, not all at once, but in pieces, the mind assembling it as the eye took it in. 3 stories, a steep roofline with dark gable peaks visible above the tree line, wooden siding weathered to the color of old bone gray-white and textured, still intact across most of the surface. A wraparound porch that sagged at the 2 visible corners but still held its shape, still present the railing intact along the entire visible length. Tall windows down the front, 2 of them cracked and one missing its glass entirely, replaced by a weather-aged piece of plywood that had been nailed in from the inside, the rest of the panes whole but filmed with the particular opacity that came from 30 years of weather and no washing. 2 massive stone chimneys, one at each end of the roof line, rising past the peak into the pale winter sky, built from river rock and red sandstone, whose colors were still visible through the frost. Behind it, the mountain, the trees, the silence of a place that had been waiting. "It's big," Calla said. Her voice was careful. It was the voice she used when she was deciding what she felt about something before she committed to feeling it, which was a habit she'd had since she was 4 and which Dara had always thought showed good sense. "Yeah," Dara said. She kept looking at it. The porch, the carved front door just visible at this distance, the windows that reflected nothing but gray cloud and the dark shapes of pine branches. Something moved in her chest, not the financial calculation she'd been running, since the attorney called the numbers from Exhibit C stacked against the numbers from the bank app on her phone, something older and less quantifiable, something that felt less like thought and more like recognition, which made no rational sense because she had never been here, had never even known this place existed until 4 days ago, and yet there was the feeling. She cut the engine. They got out. The cold hit differently at this elevation with a directness that the valley cold did not have, as if it had been concentrated by the altitude and the timber and the particular stillness of the mountain in December. Dara pulled Kala's coat tighter across her chest before she zipped it, her hands moving automatically through the gesture she'd been doing for 7 years. Kala submitted to this with the mild patience she reserved for her mother's most reflexive parenting. They walked to the front door. It was carved wood, the pattern worn soft with decades of weather, but still legible. Stars, feathers, pine cones worked into the grain by someone who had been paying attention to the landscape when they made it. The kind of carving that was not decorative exactly, but also not quite language, occupying the space between those two things. The skeleton key from the deed papers was heavy in Dara's coat pocket. She drew it out and looked at it for a moment. Heavy iron, the bow simply made the bit, showing the smooth wear of long use. She put it in the lock. It turned on the first try. The door swung inward. The air that came out was cool and still and smelled of cedar and old fabric and something else she did not immediately have a name for. Not mold, not the smell of a place that had been damaged by what had happened to it. Something more like the smell of a room that had been sleeping, that had been keeping itself in a state of suspension, waiting for the reason it was sleeping to resolve. She stepped inside. Kala came in behind her boots, quiet on the wide plank floor. The entry hall was wide and generous in a way that suggested whoever had designed it had understood how it felt to arrive at a place after a long drive on a winter road. A grand stone fireplace on the left side, built from the same river rock and red sandstone as the chimneys, the mantel still bearing a pair of iron candle holders in which the candle stubs were ancient and pale, a curved staircase on the right, the banister intact, the wood dark with age, and the oils of how many hands over how many years. The floor was wide maple planks, dusty and scuffed but solid under her feet, the kind of solid that wood achieved when it had been given decades to become fully itself. The beams above held firm. The plaster walls showed cracks in a few places, the small cracking of age and freeze-thaw cycles, but nothing structural. She moved into the main room. It was vast in the way that rooms were vast when they had been built for the purpose of containing people together, not just sheltering them separately. 2 rows of tall windows looking south over the valley, the pine trees blanketing the lower slopes in green and white, the ridgeline beyond showing the pale edge of sky over New Mexico. Even through the grime on the glass, through the film of 30 winters and 30 summers, the view was something that asked to be looked at and kept asking. Chairs stacked in the corners under old blankets, their shapes familiar through the fabric. Tables folded and leaned against the walls, the folding legs crossed like sleeping figures. A piano under a dustcloth in the far corner, one leg slightly uneven on the uneven floor, listing a few degrees from vertical. Everything covered preserved waiting. She brushed a finger along the nearest table surface, and the dust lifted in a clean streak that revealed the walnut underneath, the grain still present, the color still warm, not ruined. Sleeping, there was a difference. Mama, Calla was standing by the stone hearth pointing up at the ceiling. An iron chandelier hung from the main beam. Webbed with age, the iron rusted at the chain the original candle holders replaced at some point with electric socket fittings that had not been used in 30 years, but whole, and hanging from two of the arms, barely visible against the shadowed ceiling, the remnants of old pine bough decorations, brown and dry and brittle but still hanging from whoever had last placed them there with the intention of making something look welcoming. Dara stood in the center of the room and turned. She could feel the years in it, not as heaviness, not as oppression, more like depth, the way you felt the depth of a body of water when you were standing at the edge of it, not threatening, just present and substantial. A knock from overhead. She turned sharply, the sound coming from somewhere above the second floor. Then she understood just the wind through one of the broken windows upstairs, moving something loose against a wall. The building settling around the sound of a new person in it, the way old buildings acknowledge the presence of new bodies in the old way, through sound. She exhaled. She went to find the kitchen. The commercial kitchen was through a set of double doors at the back of the main room, large and cold, the old equipment dark with rust, but still standing in its place, with the permanence of things that were too heavy and too specific to have been taken when the building was closed. The smell of something sweet lingered in the wood, and the walls, old spice and burnt sugar, absorbed into the grain over decades of use and released now that the door was open and the air was moving. One of the industrial burners had a can of something sitting on it, not old, not vintage. The label was current, the design the same as the brand she'd seen at the Chinley market 2 weeks ago. She stepped closer. A can of pinto beans. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. Stuck to the back, a small square of yellow paper, a note in handwriting she didn't recognize. "You'll need these." She stood very still. She looked around the kitchen, at the shelves mostly empty, a few old items remaining, at the floor showing no recent marks in the dust beyond her own entrance, at the narrow window above the sink, the latch not quite fully engaged, sitting a centimeter open. She moved through the kitchen to the back door and opened it. The storage shed behind the lodge was visible through the trees, maybe 30 feet away, a smaller structure with the same weathered siding as the main building. The door was partially open, not hanging crooked on hinges, but deliberately not fully closed. She walked to it. Inside a folded wool blanket on a shelf near the back, the fold precise and intentional, not the fold of something put away in haste, but the fold of something set down carefully by someone who expected to return for it. A box of crackers still sealed in plastic. 2 empty cans of food with their labels intact and their dates legible, both consumed within the last several months based on the printing. A small camp stove and a propane canister with significant weight remaining, and hanging on a nail just inside the door, placed on the nail with deliberation rather than left there by accident. A hat, a man's hat, canvas wax, the kind designed for extended outdoor use. The brim shaped by long use into a particular downward cant on the left side that spoke of a habitual way of wearing it. Not old in the way the lodge was old, recent, worn recently. The inside band still carrying the impression of a head still faintly warm in the way of things recently removed. Dara reached out and touched the brim. It was not Elias's. The attorney had said Elias died in October. October was 2 months ago, and the belongings of a man who died in October would not feel recent in December, would not carry warmth in their leather. Someone else's hat placed on someone else's nail in a storage shed attached to a building she had just legally inherited 4 days ago. Someone was coming here, had been coming here consistently and recently, using the lodge as a stopping point, leaving supplies, returning for their hat, and presumably other things. Not randomly, not opportunistically. Someone who knew the building was here and what was in it and who was coming. She took the hat off the nail and carried it back inside and put it on the kitchen counter. She stood looking at it. The note on the bean can had said, "You'll need these." Not a threat, not a warning, not the note of someone who wanted to be anonymous about their presence. The note of someone who had considered what the arriving person would need and had provided it. Someone who knew she was coming and had wanted her to have what she needed when she arrived. She went to find Kala. Her daughter was in the main room, standing in front of the built-in bookshelves along the back wall, reading the spines of the old volumes with her head tilted at an angle. Most were covered in a uniform layer of dust that spoke of decades of undisturbed settling. A few had been touched recently, she could see by the slight disturbance in the gray film on the shelf surface in front of them, as if someone had pulled them out and replaced them. Kala pointed to one on the second shelf without touching it. "That one has my name on it," she said. Dara looked. A cloth-bound book, dark green, with a hand-lettered label on the spine, the ink old enough to have faded from black toward brown, but still legible. Kala, the label said. She pulled it out. On the cover, in the same careful pen as the spine label for the children who come after. She opened it. On the first page, a single line in the same hand. "If you are reading this, you are home." Below that, the book was blank. Clean pages, their edges slightly yellowed, but the surfaces white and unmarked. The book had been placed here not to be read, but to be written in, left empty, so that whoever arrived could fill it. She closed it gently. Kala was watching her with the careful attention she gave to things she understood were significant, without yet understanding precisely how. She handed the book to her daughter. "Keep it," Dara said. Kala held it with both hands. They ate their lunch in the main room on the floor because there was nowhere else comfortable to sit. The folded blankets from the stacked chairs serving as cushions, the tall south windows providing light, and the view of the valley providing a quality of space that the apartment in Chinle had not been able to offer in 3 years of trying. Dara ate the sandwich she'd packed from home and looked out at the valley and thought about 30 years, about a man she had never heard of paying the taxes on this building for 30 years, keeping the title clear, fighting off commercial interests, doing all of that alone with no one knowing while she grew up 2 hours away without his name. After lunch, she went back to the kitchen. She found the pantry off the back of the kitchen, a long, narrow room with deep shelves on 3 sides designed for the storage needs of a commercial kitchen that had once been feeding large numbers of people through winter holiday seasons. Most of the shelves were empty or holding the remnants of old supplies that had long since passed any usefulness. But near the back on the center shelf, placed with the same deliberateness as the can on the burner, was a second can of pinto beans. She reached for it. There was a note on the back of this one too, different handwriting. Where the first note had been quick and slightly urgent, this one was deliberate and careful, each word placed with intention. The room on the second floor at the end of the hall has a loose floorboard near the east window. The board lifts on the left side. There is a ledger underneath. Keep it safe. She stood in the pantry for a long time. 2 notes, 2 different handwritings, both left recently, both pointing her towards specific things, both written by people who knew what she would find here and wanted her to find it. This was not coincidence. This was a map. She went upstairs. The second-floor hallway was dim, the light from the windows at each end doing what it could through grime and the flat, overcast sky outside. 6 doors, 3 on each side, the wood of each door frame slightly different, as if the doors had been added over time as the building grew into what it needed to be. She tried the first, a small bedroom, the bed frame standing without its mattress, the curtains faded to the approximate color of old cream, the walls showing the pale squares where pictures had hung. She moved down the hall, trying each door, second door, third. Small rooms simply furnished the character of a place that had been built for use and comfort, rather than display or status, where the effort had gone into the craftsmanship of the structure rather than the luxury of the contents. The room at the end of the hall was different from the others, larger, 2 windows on the east wall, both intact, their glass old and slightly wavy in the way of glass that had been made before manufacturing achieved perfect flatness. The light they let in was flat and cold and honest. A bed frame with a bare mattress still on it, slightly sunken, a nightstand, a small wooden dresser missing its top drawer, the gap where it should have been holding, a faint smell of old cedar, and there, near the east window, a section of floor that was almost identical to the rest, but not quite. The boards ran in the same direction and the same color, but the gap between 2 of them was fractionally wider than the gaps elsewhere, as if the board had settled slightly differently over the years. She knelt. She pressed the left side of the board. It lifted smoothly, as if the mechanism was familiar with being operated, as if this had been done many times. The ledger underneath was leather-bound and tied with a piece of cord that might once have been cotton twine, but had dried to something closer to wire over the years. She lifted it out carefully. The leather was dry and cracked at the corners, but held together intact as a record. She untied the cord and opened it. Guest logs, names and dates going back to 1954, 7 decades of arrivals and departures recorded in the same careful hand throughout, as if the same person had kept the record from the beginning, or as if the person doing the recording had been so consistent in their practice that the variation of years had not altered the handwriting. She read a few entries. December 1959, the Running Water family, 4 children. The youngest had a fever on arrival. We kept them an extra day. She left better. December 1963, 31 guests total this season. The tree was the tallest we've had. A child named Gerald counted the ornaments twice and arrived at different numbers both times, which caused a discussion that lasted through 2 meals. December 1966, a man came alone, said he needed to think. We don't ask. He chopped wood for 3 days, left a small carving on the windowsill in the library. Still there. December 1971, full house. The children counted the ornaments on the tree, and somebody counted wrong, and they started over 4 times, and the argument about the correct number lasted through dinner, and nobody minded. December 1975, a couple came who had been here 10 years before on their first Christmas as a married couple. They brought their 2 children this time. I recognized the way the wife moved through the main room, the way she touched the mantle on the fireplace when she passed it, as if checking that it was still there. She read for a long time, until the light changed and the angle of the windows told her that the afternoon was moving toward its end. Then she closed the ledger and retied the cord and set it on the mattress and went to find the attic. The attic stairs were at the far end of the second-floor hall, behind a narrow door she'd assumed was a closet. The stairs behind it were steep and the ceiling above them was low, and she ducked her head automatically as she climbed, taking out the flashlight as the natural light from below failed to reach the upper part of the stairwell. The attic was long and narrow, cold in the specific way of spaces that were sealed and unheated and had been accumulating cold for a long time. Cedar and dust and the smell of old insulation of the materials used to build a thing that was meant to keep warmth inside, but had had no warmth to keep for 30 years. Old furniture arranged in loose rows under dusty cloths that had once been sheets, boxes stacked along the eaves, a line of winter coats hanging from nails driven into a beam, hanging without bodies inside them, in a way that was not quite unsettling, but was not quite not. She moved toward the far end. The wall was wrong. She saw it immediately, the way you saw things that were not where they were supposed to be when you were looking with full attention. At the very end of the attic, a wall that did not match the rest of the structure. The wood was slightly different, the grain running in a direction inconsistent with the original construction, the color marginally lighter under the decades of dust than the older wood around it. Someone had built this wall later. Someone had decided that the far end of the attic should be closed off from the rest of it, and had done the work carefully, but not with the same materials and not at the same time. In the center of this wall, a narrow door. She put her hand on the handle. It pulled open on the first try. No lock, just age and the swelling of wood that had absorbed and released moisture through 30 winters, releasing now with a sound that was less like a creak and more like a breath, the sound of a thing that had been holding something in and had decided to let it go. The air that came out was colder than the rest of the attic, stiller, the air of a room that had not moved since it was sealed. She stepped inside. Small, 10 feet wide at most, the ceiling sloping sharply on both sides, following the roofline. A single window layered with frost on the inside of the glass, the frost forming the elaborate mineral patterns that frost formed when it had been undisturbed for a long time. And against the left wall, a child's bed, the mattress slightly sunken with age, but the quilt folded on top of it, placed with the specific care of someone who folded things, because the folding mattered, not just the folded result. A bookshelf beside the bed, the shelves full of small wooden figurines, animals and birds carved from pine, with varying degrees of skill, each one different, each one having been made by someone learning as they went, the later ones better than the earlier ones. A stack of picture books so worn at the spines that the titles had rubbed away. The walls were painted green. The paint had faded to something between sage and gray, the color of old sage in winter. High on the far wall, strung from one corner, molding to the other, a string of paper snowflakes. Dry now, fragile, the paper having gone from white to ivory, the cuts slightly crumbled at the delicate tips, but still hanging, still in place. She stood in the middle of the room. It had been loved. That was the word that arrived. Not abandoned in the way she'd expected, not left in haste or in indifference. Loved and then closed with care. There was a difference between those things that mattered. She moved to the bed and looked beneath it. A box, cedar, smaller than a suitcase, larger than a shoebox. She pulled it out and placed it on the floor in front of her and opened the lid. Photographs. Dozens of them, black and white with scalloped edges from a particular era of printing that she could roughly date by the style. Polaroids curled slightly at the corners from the temperature changes of 30 years, loose prints in small paper frames, some of the frames warped. She lifted them out carefully, one at a time. The lodge in different seasons. children on a snow-covered slope with a red wooden sled, a group of people around a bonfire, their faces bright in the firelight, their breath visible in the dark air around them. A couple standing in front of a tall pine tree hung with ornaments, the woman's head turned slightly toward the man, both of them looking at something beyond the frame. Men in work clothes repairing a section of porch, two of them on ladders, one below, handing up a board. Women in the kitchen, three of them laughing at something behind the camera, caught in the middle of the laugh, open and unconsidered. She went through them slowly, and then she stopped. A woman, young, maybe 22 or 23, dark hair pulled back from her face with a clip, wearing a knit sweater with a geometric pattern at the collar in dark blue and white. She was standing in the main room downstairs, positioned near the south windows, with the valley just barely visible behind her through the grime of the glass. She was looking at something off to the right of the frame, her profile clear and composed, her expression caught in the particular moment between a smile and the more private thing that came before or after the smile. Dara looked at this photograph. She did not know why her hands had gone still. She noticed that they had, and she did not know why. She turned it over. On the back, in small, careful letters that had been placed there by someone who understood that photographs without labels lost their meaning as time went on, Nola. Summer of '88. Nola. Her mother's name had been Nola. Her hands were not shaking. They had simply become very still, the way hands became still when a body was processing something that required all available attention and could not spare any for peripheral movement. She set that photograph face up on the floor beside her. She went through the rest of the box. There were more. Nola in the kitchen laughing, the laugh you could not quite hear but could feel in the tilt of her head and the way her hands were raised. Nola on the porch with a mug looking out at the valley with the expression of someone who had been doing this every morning for long enough that it had become the best part of the day. Nola on the sledding slope below the lodge holding the rope of a red wooden sled, her posture relaxed in the cold as if the cold were simply weather and not an obstacle. And then toward the bottom of the box, a cluster of photographs that were different from the others in quality and in subject. Nola, visibly pregnant, standing in the front doorway of the lodge, her hands at her sides rather than on her belly, which was the posture of someone accustomed to being pregnant and not performing it. The year written on the back, 1990. Nola, holding a newborn, wrapped in a pale blanket, the newborn's face turned away from the camera, only the curve of a dark-haired head visible. Nola's face looking down at the bundle with an expression of absolute attention. And then Nola, crouching on the ground in front of the lodge, her arms around a small child. The child's face turned slightly toward the camera. A girl, maybe 2 years old, possibly approaching 3, dark hair, a knit sweater too large for her frame, the sleeves pushed up at the wrists to free her hands. On the back, in the same careful hand, Nola and baby girl, Red Mesa, summer 1992. Dara put the photograph down on the floor. She sat back against the wall of the room. She had been told her mother died 3 days after she was born. She had been told this by the older cousin who had raised her after her grandmother passed when Dara was 9, told it in the flat voice of someone reporting a fact they had told before and found neither interesting nor painful anymore. She had been told there were no photographs, no records, nothing to look at. She had been told her mother was a young woman who had a difficult birth and had not survived it. The child in this photograph was at least 2 years old, possibly 3. If that was Dara and she could not look at that small face turned toward the camera that particular way the head was held without knowing absolutely that it was then. Her mother had not died 3 days after her birth. Her mother had lived, had been here, had held her and crouched on the gravel path of this lodge in the summer of 1992, and someone had taken a photograph of them together, which meant the story she had been told was not the story that had happened. She sat in the sealed room in the attic of the Red Mesa Lodge with the photograph spread on the floor around her and the paper snowflakes moving very slightly above her head in the current her entrance had created, and she did not cry. She did not speak because Calla was downstairs and because there were no words yet for what she was sitting in the middle of no language that had been developed for the specific experience of discovering that the foundational story of your life was constructed rather than true. She picked up the photograph of the small girl in the too large sweater and the woman crouching beside her. She turned it over. Summer 1992. She put it in her jacket pocket. She sat for another few minutes in the cold room with the faded green walls. Then she heard Calla calling from the bottom of the attic stairs, her voice carrying the particular note of a child who has been patient for a while and has decided that the appropriate interval has now passed. She gathered the photographs back into the cedar box. She closed the lid. She left the box on the floor of the sealed room and pulled the door closed behind her and went down through the attic and down the stairs and found her daughter standing in the hallway on the second floor with her coat buttoned and her boots on and the canvas bag over her shoulder with the green book inside it. "I thought you got lost," Calla said. Dara looked at her. "Just looking around," she said. Calla studied her face with the particular attention of a 7-year-old who had been reading her mother's expressions all her life and had developed considerable accuracy. "Did you find something?" Dara thought about the photograph in her pocket, the cedar box on the floor upstairs, the note in the pantry, the man's hat on the kitchen counter. "Yes," she said, "I found some things." They went downstairs. They walked through the main room one more time, and Dara stopped at the stone hearth and looked at the mantel. There was something there she hadn't noticed before, small and white against the dark stone. A matchbook, white and crisp, not faded or weathered. A logo from a gas station in Gallup she recognized from the road. She picked it up. One match was missing from an otherwise complete book. Someone had lit something with this matchbook recently, not weeks ago, days. She pocketed the matchbook. They walked out to the truck. Dara locked the front door, the iron key heavy in her hand. She stood for a moment on the porch looking out at the valley that Elias Nez had looked out at for 30 years, and her mother had looked out at before that, and she looked at it for long enough to know she would be looking at it again. "Mama." Calla was standing by the truck, her breath visible in the cold air. "Are we coming back?" Dara looked at the lodge one more time, at the weathered siding and the stone chimneys and the tall windows and the porch that sagged at its corners but held. "Yes," she said, "we're coming back." She did not tell Calla what she'd found in the attic room. Not yet, because some things needed to be thought about before they were spoken, and she was not done thinking. On the drive back down the mountain, Calla fell asleep before they reached the paved road. Dara drove in the particular careful way of driving a mountain road in December, attentive to the surface, and she thought about a woman named Nola standing in a doorway in 1990 with a rounded belly, and a woman named Nola crouching in the summer of 1992 with her arms around a small girl. She thought about 30 years of taxes paid and a fight against commercial interests she'd read about in the legal file, and a lawyer in Denver who had said he wanted it in family hands. She thought about the note on the pinto beans. She thought about a man's hat on a nail. She thought about the two different handwritings on the two notes, someone who was deliberate and careful, someone who was quick and urgent. Two different people, both of them wanting her to find specific things, both of them knowing she was coming. The valley opened below them as they came off the mountain, the lights of Chinle coming on in the early winter dusk. She did not feel like smiling yet, but she felt like something was beginning, which was its own kind of warmth, the specific warmth of a direction after a long time of simply staying in place. She went back on Monday, alone this time. Kala was in school. Rosie had let her keep the truck through the week on the condition that Dara covered Saturday morning, which she would have covered regardless. She left Chinle before 7 with a thermos of coffee and the tool bag from the apartment closet and the question she hadn't been able to stop thinking about since Friday. The drive up felt different the second time. She knew the road now. She knew where the GPS would surrender and where to look for the wooden posts and how the lodge would appear at the final curve. She knew what the key felt like in the lock. She knew what the air inside smelled like. She parked in the same spot and sat for a moment with the engine off. The lodge looked the same. Of course it did, but it looked less like a thing she had found and more like a thing she had come back to, and there was a difference in that perception that she noted without yet fully understanding. She checked the storage shed first. The blanket was still on the shelf, the camp stove and the propane canister, the empty food cans, but the hat was gone from the nail. She stood in the doorway looking at the nail. The nail was still there. The hat was not. Someone had come back for it since Friday. She went inside. The can of pinto beans was still on the kitchen burner where she'd left it. She'd moved the second can from the pantry to the counter on Friday, and both notes were still attached to their cans. She read them again, not because she'd forgotten them, but because the handwriting was telling her something she was still working out. The first note was written quickly, the pressure of the pen variable, the letters slightly uneven in a way that suggested a person writing in a hurry, or writing outdoors on an unstable surface, or writing with something specific on their mind that made careful penmanship secondary. The second note was deliberate, each letter formed with attention, the words chosen with care. The same person she thought in different states of mind, or different moments of different days, or a person who wrote quickly when they were being direct about a need and carefully when they were providing information. She went upstairs to the attic. The cedar box was where she'd left it, on the floor of the sealed room. She carried it downstairs and put it on the big table in the main room and opened it in the better light. The photographs again. She went through them more slowly this time, laying them out on the table in rough chronological order, based on the quality of the printing and the style of the people's clothing and the condition of the lodge in the backgrounds. The early years, the furniture different, the porch railing straight and freshly painted. The middle years, more guests, more elaborate Christmas decorations. The tree in the northeast corner growing taller in successive years. The later years, sparser, fewer guests. The photographs more personal in subject. Nola appeared first in a photograph dated 1988, then in 1989, then 1990, the pregnancy photograph, then a gap in which there were no photographs of her, as if whoever was documenting had stopped or had not been present, and then toward the bottom of the box, the summer 1992 photograph, the small girl with the too large sweater, Nothing after that. Dara laid the 1992 photograph on the table and looked at it in the flat winter light coming through the south windows. She was still looking at it when she heard the truck. She went to the south windows and looked down at the drive. A Ranger Service pickup, olive green paint, was pulling in beside the truck she'd borrowed from Rosie. She watched the door open. A man got out, late 30s, broad in the shoulders, wearing the tan jacket of the Regional Ranger Service with the collar turned up against the cold. He looked at the borrowed truck for a moment. Then he looked at the lodge. He did not look surprised. Dara went downstairs and opened the front door before he reached the porch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps. Dara Nez. He said it with the inflection of someone confirming rather than asking. She said yes. Holt Yazzie. He held up an ID badge briefly. I patrol this region. Saw the tracks last week and checked with the county land office over the weekend. They told me the property changed hands. She came out onto the porch. He had a direct way of looking at things, the kind that came from years of working terrain where people sometimes needed to be found and sometimes did not want to be, and he had learned to look carefully before deciding what he was seeing. He said, "You all right up here?" She said, "I found some things I wasn't expecting." He said, "That usually happens." He said it without irony, which meant he'd seen it before. He came up the steps, and she led him inside. He walked the main room the way someone walked a place they had been to before, not possessively, carefully, the way you walked through something you'd been concerned about for a long time and were relieved to find still standing. "I used to come up here when I was a kid," he said. "My mother brought us. December usually. They had a tree in that corner." He pointed to the northeast corner where the baseboard still showed the ghost of a tree stand and the faint dark stain of old sap on the floor. Man in a red coat read stories beside the fireplace on the last night of every season. I thought it was the most important place in the world. He ran his hand along the old banister. He looked at the photographs she'd spread across the main table. He didn't touch them. He looked at the one of Nola by the south windows. He said, "I remember her." Dara went very still. "She worked the front desk for a few years," he said. "When I was small, she had a laugh you could hear from outside if the windows were open." His expression was careful. He looked up at Dara. "You look like her," Dara said. "She was my mother." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I didn't know she had a daughter." She said, "I didn't know she was here." He looked at the photographs again, at the 1992 one. He said, after a pause that contained something he was deciding how to handle, "I think you should come see something." He drove her down the mountain in the Ranger truck, and she followed in the borrowed truck, the two vehicles moving in a slow line through the timber. He pulled into the ranger station at the base of the eastern slope, a low building with a covered equipment bay and the flag of the Navajo Nation on a pole beside the entrance. Inside, he led her to a back room and showed her a cardboard box sitting on the floor beside a folding table. He said, "Found this in our intake records 3 months ago. We hold unclaimed mail that comes in for properties that no longer have active occupants. The address doesn't exist anymore in the postal system, so anything sent there ends up here eventually." She looked at the box. He said, "It was addressed to you. Different addresses over the years, all of them yours. Whoever sent these kept updating the address. They found your locations and kept trying." She sat down in the chair beside the table. He lifted the lid off the box. Letters. A thick pile of letters, each one with a return address from Red Mesa Lodge or from a post office box in Gallup, New Mexico. She picked up the top envelope. Her name, an address in Window Rock that she'd lived at between the ages of 9 and 14. The return stamp from the post office was in red ink: refused, returned to sender. She picked up another. Her name, an address in Shiprock from when she was 18, refused, returned to sender. She went through the stack methodically. 12 envelopes in total. The dates range from 2002 to 2019. Someone had found her at every address she'd lived at across 17 years and had mailed a letter to each one. And at every single address, the letters had been refused, sent back unopened, without telling her they had come. The first envelope was dated 2002. She would have been 12 years old. She held that envelope in her hands and looked at the stamp. Holt was quiet beside her. She said, "The cousin who raised me." He didn't answer because he didn't need to. She said, "She received these. She refused them. She never told me." She stacked the envelopes carefully back in the box in the order she'd found them and put the lid back on. Elias Nez had found her 12 times in 17 years, had updated her address every time she moved, which meant he'd been tracking her movements through some means she could not yet identify, which meant he had never stopped trying to reach her. He had done this from 2002 until 2019, and then had made a different decision, had secured things in a trust, had hired a lawyer in Denver, and had waited. She said, "Can I take this?" He said, "It's addressed to you." She put the box in the back seat of the borrowed truck and drove back up the mountain. She spent the rest of the morning in Elias's private records room, which she'd forced open with the crowbar from her tool bag. The door had been swollen shut with years of cold and moisture, and open on the third try with a sound like something finally giving in. Inside, metal filing cabinets and wooden shelves holding boxes of documents, the ledgers she'd already found, and on the far wall a hand-drawn map on heavy paper, the property lines marked in careful ink, the lodge and outbuildings labeled, the two parcels delineated with different ink, the main parcel 12 acres, the secondary parcel labeled simply Nez 1955, 400 acres, annotated with the creek lines and the timber stands and the elevation contours. And in the corner of the map, in the same hand that had drawn everything else, a note, Cresswell Land Company. 3 dates, 1978, 1989, 2003, a line drawn through each date with force, the pen pressing hard into the paper. She pulled the filing cabinet drawers open one by one. The third drawer held the legal files. She read for an hour. She was not a lawyer, but she had learned to read documents carefully because documents were the mechanisms by which things happen to people, and she had understood since she was young that ignoring them was a form of complicity in whatever they did to you. What she understood at the end of the hour was this: Elias's father, a man named Cub Nez, had purchased 400 acres of fee, simple private land in the Chuska mountain foothills in 1955, land outside the formal boundaries of the Navajo Nation's trust holdings, purchased legally from a private seller during a period when some parcels in the region were changing hands between individual owners. On that land grew substantial stands of ponderosa pine with commercial value. Through the land also ran 2 perennial water sources, year-round creeks, fed by snowmelt that carried prior appropriation water rights under New Mexico law rights that predated most of the current regulatory framework. In 1978, a land development company called Cresswell had approached Cub Nez and offered to buy the 400 acres outright. He had refused. In 1989, Cresswell had approached Elias, who had inherited the land from his father. They had offered substantially more. He had refused. In 2003, Cresswell had filed suit in federal court, arguing that the original 1955 purchase contained procedural irregularities sufficient to void the title. Elias had retained legal representation and defended the title in court. He had won. The appraised value noted in the 2021 document from an independent assessor was the number she had seen in Exhibit C of the attorney's letter, but had not quite absorbed. She absorbed it now. She sat back in the chair. She looked at the 3 lines through the Cresswell dates on the map, drawn with force, each one. Elias had spent 50 years refusing to sell, had spent his own money defending a title 3 times, had managed a lodge that closed, maintained a property that sat empty, paid taxes on 2 parcels every year for 30 years, and spent 17 years attempting to contact the granddaughter of a woman who had once stood by the south windows of this lodge, laughing at something she couldn't see. She put the legal files back in the drawer. She was about to leave the records room when she saw it, on the corner of the desk under a coffee mug left turned upside down as if by habit, a small envelope, not old, not sealed, just folded shut, the flap tucked in, her name on the front in the same deliberate handwriting as the second pantry note. She opened it. Dara, if you find this room, you're doing it right. Everything in this cabinet belongs to you now. The fight with Cresswell isn't finished. Get a lawyer who knows land rights. The 2003 judgment helps you, but they'll try again when the transfer goes through. Don't wait. The name to call is in the back of the top drawer inside a red folder. He's already been briefed. He's waiting to hear from you. No signature. The same handwriting as the second pantry note. She went back to the filing cabinet and opened the top drawer and found the red folder and found inside it the business card of a land rights attorney in Albuquerque with a sticky note attached in different handwriting. She's coming. Tell her everything. She was still standing there when she heard the sound at the edge of the tree line outside. She went to the narrow window of the records room. A woman, standing at the place where the lodge's cleared land met the forest right at the boundary between maintained and wild, not moving, older silver in her hair worn loose against her woven coat. She was looking at the lodge with the directness of someone who had been looking at it for a long time in her mind and was now doing it in person, and who had done this before many times in the years when there had been nothing to see but the empty building. Dara went outside. The cold came up sharp from the snow, the midday sun doing nothing in particular against it. She walked across the open ground toward the woman. The woman did not move, did not retreat, just watched her come with the steady patience of someone who had been waiting for a while and was not troubled by a little more waiting. When Dara was close enough to see the woman's eyes, the woman spoke first. She said, "You're hers." Dara said, "I'm looking for people who knew my mother." The woman said, "I know. I saw you here last week. Decided to let you come to it on your own first." She said her name was Flora Benally. She had known Nola, had known her well. They went inside and sat in the main room on the floor with a propane heater between them because it was the warmest option available, and Flora said she'd sat on worse floors in her long life and produced a thermos of coffee from the canvas bag she'd been carrying without waiting to be offered anything. Dara told her what she'd found, the photographs, the box of refused letters. She laid the 1992 photograph on the floor between them. Flora looked at it for a long time. She said, "I took that picture." Dara waited. Flora said, Your mother came here in 1988. She was 20 years old. She needed work, and Elias needed help at the front desk through the winter season. She was good at it from the first day. She knew everyone's name after the first time she heard it. She remembered what mattered to people, what they were afraid of, what made them comfortable. She had a gift for making people feel that the place they were in was the right place for them to be. Dara said, "How long did she stay?" Flora said, "She stayed until she couldn't anymore." Dara said, "When was that?" Flora looked at the blue circle of the heater flame. She said your mother had a heart condition. She'd known about it since she was 19. She managed it carefully. She came through your birth fine, contrary to what you were told. You were born right here in the room at the end of the second floor hall in December of 1990. It was a hard December and the roads were iced over, and Elias delivered you himself because getting down the mountain wasn't possible. She paused. The condition worsened for the first time seriously in the fall of 1991. She had good months and bad months after that. In the spring of 1994, she had a bad episode and Elias drove her to the hospital in Gallup. They didn't have much to offer her by that point. She came back here. She had more time after that. Not much. Dara said, "She didn't die 3 days after I was born." Flora said, "No. She said she was here with me until I was at least 2 years old." Flora said she was here with you until you were 4. Dara said nothing for a moment. Flora said she knew she was running out of time. She was very clear about what she wanted for you. She wrote things down. She made preparations the way a person made preparations when they understood the timeline. She made Elias promise to find you if anything happened, and he made that promise and kept it for 30 years through everything. Dara said, "The cousin who refused his letters." Flora was quiet for a moment. Then she said Elias tried. He never stopped trying until he found another way. Dara said the cousin received those letters, 12 of them over 17 years. She refused every one. She never told me. Flora said, "I don't know if it was grief or fear or something in between. Some people close off the past the way you'd close off a room where something painful happened. They don't do it with malice. They do it because they don't have the resources to hold both the past and the present at the same time, and they've chosen the present." Dara said nothing to that. Flora reached into the pocket of her woven coat and drew out something small, a piece of paper folded twice. The folds softened with age and handling. She said, "I've had this for a long time waiting. Your mother left it with me before she died. She said when Dara is old enough to understand, it makes sure she gets this." She held it out. Dara took it. She did not open it yet. She held it with both hands and looked at Flora. She said there was someone else, a man she mentioned, someone who should have been here. Flora's face changed, not dramatically, a slight tightening around the eyes, the face of someone deciding what to share and what to hold. She said, "I don't know what you're referring to." Dara said, "Yes, you do." Flora looked at the heater. She said, "That's a story for a different day, when you know this place better." She said a name briefly the way you said the name of something you didn't want to make larger by saying it too directly. Damon. Then she looked away and the subject was closed in the way that subjects were closed by people who had decided when they would open them. Dara filed the name, filed the way Flora's face had changed, filed the fact that Flora had been coming to this place for years, leaving supplies and notes and a hat on a nail watching from the trees. She said, "The notes in the pantry, the hat." Flora looked at her. She said, "You've been coming here." Flora said, "Somebody had to keep an eye on things." She said it without defensiveness, as simply as she might have said, "The sky is gray today," the way you said things that explained themselves entirely. Dara looked at the woman across the heater, Flora Benali, 70 years old, maybe more, silver hair and sharp eyes and a woven coat and a thermos of coffee and 30 years of keeping watch over a place most people had forgotten. She said, "The second note, the one about the loose floorboard, that was you." Flora said, "Elias told me where he kept things, in case someone came." Dara said, "In case I came." Flora said, "Yes." The afternoon light was going flat and gray by the time Flora got up to leave. She buttoned her coat and picked up her thermos and walked to the door and then stopped with one hand on the frame. She said, "Your mother used to say this building held memory the way stone held heat." Long after the source was gone, she went out. Dara stood in the main room listening to the sound of Flora's footsteps and then the distant sound of a vehicle she hadn't heard arrive, starting up somewhere in the trees and moving away down the mountain. Then the lodge was quiet again. She sat on the floor and opened the piece of paper Flora had given her. It was small, folded twice the fold, soft with age. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was different from Elias's, different from the pantry notes, smaller, rounder, written with more urgency. It said, "If you have this, it means Flora kept her word. I could not stay as long as I wanted to, but I watched you for 4 years, Dara. I watched you learn to walk, and I watched you figure out how to get what you wanted without asking for it directly, which is something you got from me. And I watched you laugh, and the way you laughed was like something the mountains had made. I hope somebody has been good to you. I hope you found people. This lodge is yours because you are mine. That's all. Come home. N." Dara sat with the note in her hands for a long time. Her mother had put those paper snowflakes up in the sealed room. She didn't know how she knew that, but she knew it with the certainty of something felt rather than reason, the way you knew certain things about people who were gone and whom you had never consciously known. She folded the note carefully and put it in her coat pocket next to the photograph. She went to find the cedar box. She left it on the floor of the sealed attic room. She climbed back through the attic and through the narrow door, and the room was the same, the green walls and the child's bed and the wooden birds on the shelf and the paper snowflakes on the string above her head. She brought the cedar box downstairs and put it on the main table and opened it again. She'd gone through the photographs on her first visit. Beneath the photographs, she'd been aware of other things in the box, but had been absorbed in the images and had not looked further. Now she lifted the photographs out and set them aside. Below them, a bundle of envelopes tied with a piece of pale ribbon that might once have been white. She lifted the bundle out. The envelopes were addressed in the same round handwriting as the note Flora had given her. She ran her thumb across the top edges, counting 18 envelopes, each one with a number written in the top right corner in the same round hand, 1 through 18. She looked at the top envelope. 1. She turned it over. On the back, "For your first birthday." She sat down. Her hands were completely steady, which was not what she expected, which was not what the moment seemed to call for. But that was how it worked sometimes. The body made its own decisions about what the moment required. The body had decided that this moment required stillness. She held the bundle. She had been told there was nothing, no photographs, no records, no letters, nothing to look at and nothing to hold. A young woman who had a difficult birth and did not survive it and had left nothing behind. 18 birthday letters tied with a ribbon in a cedar box in a sealed room in the attic of a lodge in the Chuska Mountains. She did not open the first letter, Not here, not now alone on the floor in the cold with the light going and the heater running low. She needed more than this circumstances offered for the experience of reading those letters properly. She set the bundle on the table and went back to the cedar box. Under the space where the letters had been one more envelope, this one not numbered. On the front, in the same round writing, "Before you were born." She sat very still, a letter written before she existed. She opened it. The paper inside was a single sheet folded twice. The writing was cramped toward the bottom, where her mother had run out of space and had compressed the letters to fit more words. "My girl, I don't know your name yet, I don't know your face, but I know you're going to have something I've been watching for my whole life, which is the quality of knowing exactly what the world costs and deciding to be here anyway. I felt that in you before you were here to feel. I'm going to name you Dara, which means compassion, because I think the world needs more people who carry it without making it small. I want you to know something before you know anything else. The people who build things from nothing are not lucky. They are not special. They simply decided to believe in what they were doing until it became real, and that act of deciding is available to everyone who has ever stood in a cold room with $2 and a question and no clear answer. I have done that. I expect you will too. I love you, which I want to say before I've even met you, because some things should not wait. Your mother. December 1989. Dara put the letter down on the table. She looked at the south windows of the main room, the valley beyond them going dark as the afternoon ended. Her mother had written this letter the month before she was born and had folded it and put it in a cedar box and had trusted that someday, somehow, the cedar box would end up in the right hands. She picked up the letter and folded it along its original creases and put it in her pocket. She sat for a while in the quiet lodge with the photographs on the table and the bundle of birthday letters beside them and the box from the ranger station in the back seat outside. The questions were larger now than they'd been this morning. Her mother had not died 3 days after her birth. Her mother had lived here with her for 4 years and had written 18 birthday letters and 1 letter written before she existed, and had made Flora promise to deliver the last one, and had told Elias to find her daughter, and had made preparations for everything she could see coming. And Dara had grown up with none of it, had grown up with a story about 3 days and nothing left behind, had grown up thinking there was a gap where her mother should have been, because the gap was real and enormous and shaped like a person, except the person had been here, had written her name in the snow of her daughter's life before her daughter had a face. She picked up the bundle of 18 letters. She put them in her bag. She put the 1992 photograph in her bag. She locked the front door and drove down the mountain. The lights of Chinle came into view, and she thought about what it meant to have a home prepared for you before you knew you needed it, and what it meant to have been lied to by someone who was supposed to love you, and what it meant that 30 years of locked doors and refused letters and kept secrets had ended with a key mailed in a cream-colored envelope from a lawyer in Denver. She thought about the name Flora had said and then refused to say more about. Damon. She thought about the hat on the nail. She thought about the notes in 2 different handwritings. The careful, deliberate one was Flora. The quick, urgent one on the first bean can she was less sure about. She parked outside the apartment complex. She sat in the truck for a moment. Then she went upstairs and picked up Kala from Mrs. Yazzie and made soup for dinner and sat with her daughter at the small kitchen table and watched her eat and thought about a lodge on a mountain full of things that had been waiting for exactly as long as they needed to wait. She would read the first letter tonight. Calla said, "You're thinking loud again." Dara looked at her. "Yeah," she said. "Sorry." Calla said, "Is it about the lodge?" She said, "Yes." Calla said, "Can we go back?" Dara looked at her daughter, at the way the kitchen light caught the angle of her face, at the quality of attention her daughter brought to the simplest question, which was the same quality she brought to everything. She thought about her mother's words, the quality of knowing exactly what the world costs and deciding to be here anyway. She said, "We're going back. We're going to stay." Calla was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I knew." Dara said, "How?" Calla said, "Because you came home different the first time. Not sad different, ready different." Dara looked at her daughter. She thought, "You are your grandmother's child, and you do not know it yet." She said, "Eat your soup." The decision to stay did not announce itself with certainty. It arrived the way most real decisions arrived, not as a single moment, but as the accumulation of smaller ones, each one narrowing the options until what remained was not really a choice anymore, but simply the truth of what you were going to do. She gave notice on the apartment on a Wednesday. The property manager sounded relieved, which told her something about the waiting list and something about the state of the building and something about how invisible a person could become inside a system designed to process them. She gave the truck back to Rosie with a full tank and a box of the good coffee from the market, the kind Rosie served at the diner and never bought for herself. Rosie said, "You're going up there for real." Dara said, "Yeah." Rosie looked at her for a long time with the expression of a woman who had watched other people make decisions for 40 years and had developed opinions about which ones held. She said, "Good." She handed back the keys. She said, "Whenever you need to come to town, don't argue with me about it." Dara did not argue. She told Calla on a Thursday night over dinner. She said, "We're going to the lodge. We're going to fix it up and stay." Calla looked up from her bowl of soup with the expression Dara had been watching for 7 years, the one that preceded the question that went to the center of things. Calla said, "What about school?" Dara said. "There's a school in the valley. 40 minutes. I checked." Calla said, "What about Mrs. Yazzie?" Dara said. "We'll come back to visit, and she can come to us." Calla thought about this with the seriousness she applied to logistical questions, turning it over and examining it. She said, "Okay." She went back to her soup. Dara looked at her daughter eating soup at the small kitchen table in the apartment with the broken overhead light and the thin walls and the parking lot outside the window, and she thought about a mountain and a valley and a set of south-facing windows that let in more light than this apartment had seen in 3 years. She said she was here before we were ready to come. She waited. Calla looked up. She said, "The lodge." Dara said, "Yeah." Calla said, "Places don't wait." Dara said, "Some do." Calla considered this seriously and then nodded once with the finality of someone whose mind was made up. They moved on a Saturday. Rosie's truck and a borrowed trailer from one of the market workers, and the lightness that came from having owned very little for a very long time. The apartment emptied in 4 hours. They drove up the mountain with the trailer rattling behind them on the switchbacks, and Calla watching the elevation change with the attention she gave everything. When the lodge appeared at the final curve, Calla pressed her palm to the cold glass of the window. She said, "There it is." Dara said, "There it is." They spent the first week working. Holt came on the second day with 2 thermoses and a bundle of firewood and a box of electrical supplies and a cousin named Ben who operated heavy equipment for a living and had opinions about everything and a laugh that filled the main room the way the room had been built to be filled, and who had said when he first walked in and saw the stone hearth, "I used to come here when I was 10. The man who ran this place let me sit here all afternoon once when I had a bad day. Didn't ask what was wrong, just kept feeding the fire and handed me hot cider. That's the most important thing anyone ever did for me." He said it without sentiment, the way people said true things that had settled into fact over years of being carried. Holt got one of the lights working on the second floor, then the main room, then the kitchen. The generator was old but functional. The water lines needed flushing, but the pipes themselves held. The fireplace worked after Holt and Ben spent a morning on the roof clearing the chimney with equipment Ben produced from the back of his truck. The first fire went in on a Wednesday evening. Dara knelt by the hearth and struck the match and touched it to the dry pine kindling and sat back on her heels and watched the fire establish itself, the way fire always established itself. Uncertain first, then decided, then committed. Calla sat beside her with her knees drawn up and her back against the stone. The main room changed when the fire was in it. The proportions changed. The ceiling came down and the walls came in, and the space became something that could hold people instead of just containing them. "This is what it was supposed to feel like," Calla said. Dara said, "Yeah." She said, "How do you know what it was supposed to feel like?" Calla said, "Because it feels like it's supposed to feel like something." Flora came on a Thursday. She came without announcement, driving up the mountain in a truck that had seen decades of mountain roads and had the dents to document them, wearing the same woven coat and carrying a box of supplies that she set down in the kitchen without explaining and without being asked. She walked the main room and the kitchen and the hallway and looked at what had been cleaned and what had been repaired and what was still waiting. She said, "The piano. Has anyone looked at it?" Dara said, "Not yet." Flora went to the piano and lifted the dust cloth and pressed one key. The note was flat and aged and had been waiting in that string for 30 years. She pressed it again. She said, "It'll tune." She pressed 3 keys together and listened to the way they resolved against each other, the combination not quite right but not quite wrong. She said, "It'll need work, but it'll tune." She covered it again carefully. She turned to Dara and said, "I have something to tell you about Damon." Dara said, "I know." Flora said, "You don't know all of it." Dara said, "Tell me." They sat at the long table in the main room with the fire going and the new light from the overhead fixture warming the space in a way that the daylight and the fire together had not quite managed on their own, and Flora told her. Damon had come to Red Mesa in 1989, a year after Nola. He had grown up in the eastern part of the nation. He had come looking for work the same way Nola had come looking for work, because he had skills and no place to use them, and the world outside had made clear enough times that his skills were not the kind it compensated fairly. He was good with his hands. He had helped build the addition on the east side of the lodge. He had repaired the sledding slope relaying the boards after a wet spring had warped several of them. He had been present at Dara's birth, which had been a difficult December night with the roads iced over and no way down the mountain. He and Nola had been together for 2 years before Dara was born. He had stayed through the first winter of Dara's life, through the spring, through the summer. He had been there. In the fall of 1991, Nola's condition had worsened for the first time badly enough that they understood the shape of what was coming, even if they could not see its exact dimensions. They had begun the conversations that people had when they understood the timeline and needed to make decisions in advance of the time when making decisions would be harder. They had settled on the cousin. She had a house and resources and was family in the formal sense and was willing to take a child. The cousin had conditions. Flora said she told him that if he stayed in the picture, she would not take the child. She said she would not raise a child with a father who appeared and disappeared according to his own schedule. She wanted the arrangement clean. She said those words, clean. Dara said nothing. Flora said, he said he would stay. He said he would not leave. And the cousin said, then find another arrangement. And she left. Dara looked at the fire. Flora said Nola was too ill by then to manage a fight on multiple fronts. She needed to know you would be taken care of. She needed the arrangement settled before things got worse. She asked him to go. She paused. She didn't want to. He didn't want to. But she could not fight the cousin and manage the illness at the same time. And the most important front was you. Dara said, he went. Flora said, he went. And Nola died in the spring of 1994, and you went to the cousin, and Elias spent 17 years trying to reach you through letters that were refused at every address. Dara said, where is he now? Flora was quiet for a moment. She said, he never went far. He's been in the area since the fall, since he heard Elias had died. Dara looked at her. She said, the first note, the one on the pinto beans on the kitchen burner. Flora looked at her. She said that was him. He came here after Elias passed. He knew about the will, had known for years what Elias intended. He wanted to see the place before you arrived. He left the note because he knew some of what you'd need to find. Dara said, he knows where Elias kept things. Flora said they were in contact for 30 years. He drove Elias to the hospital in Gallup twice. He kept in touch the way people kept in touch when the formal channels were closed to them. Dara sat with this. She thought about the notes in two handwritings, the careful, deliberate one from Flora, the quick, urgent one from a man who had been living near this mountain for 30 years, not quite leaving, not quite staying. She said, does he know about Kala? Flora said he knows what I've told him, which is that you have a daughter. That's all. Dara looked at the fire. She said, where is he now? Flora said, he'll come when he's ready. Or he won't. That's between you. She said it plainly, without pressure in either direction. The way someone spoke about a thing they had watched from a distance for a long time and had learned not to push. Dara nodded. The work continued. Vera Tso from the chapter house came on a Sunday and brought quilts she'd been storing since the lodge closed, recognizing them as belonging to the building in the way that certain things belong to certain places and were diminished by being anywhere else. She brought two women with her who had the particular competence of people who knew how to organize a space for use, and they spent a day unfurling rugs and airing fabric and replacing the dust cloths over the furniture with the quilts, which were heavy and colorful and changed the character of every surface they touched. Holt asked if they were planning to reopen. Dara said, I don't know yet what it becomes. I know it becomes something. He nodded. He said people have been asking. Since word got out that the property changed hands, the community groups, the elders, people who came here as children, they want to see it. She said, let them come. He said, when? She said, December. Before Christmas, if we can manage it. He said, we can manage it. He left and came back the next day with Ben and two other men from the chapter house who had building skills and time and who took one look at the sagging porch corners and began assessing and planning without being asked to make the case for why it was necessary. Calla attended her new school 40 minutes down the mountain from the first Monday, riding with Holt on his patrol route in the mornings and with Flora in the afternoons. She came home each day with the energy of a child who had found the social environment of a new school interesting rather than frightening, which Dara had expected, because Calla had always treated new environments as problems to be understood rather than threats to be endured. She made a friend named Sana who had a horse. This resolved the horse book item on the Christmas list more completely than any book could have. Dara spent the evenings reading the birthday letters. She read them in order, 1 through 18, each one written in the year it was meant for her mother, writing forward into a future she could not see, each one containing something specific, some detail that could only have been written by someone who knew who Dara was before Dara existed. The letter for age 7 described Dara's laugh with a precision that stopped her breath, the exact sound of it, the way it rose before she was ready for it, too specific to be general, too accurate to be invented. The letter for age 12 described the quality of her stubbornness, the way it was not loud, but settled the way she went quiet rather than loud when she had decided something. And this was Dara at 12 and Dara at 34, and it had always been Dara, and her mother had known it before she was born. The letter for age 19 said, "I imagine you are doing something hard right now. You always choose the harder thing, not out of stubbornness, but because you have a quality I can only describe as accuracy. You see things correctly. That makes the easier thing feel like the wrong answer." She read them the way you read things that were both very old and happening right now, which was the only way they could be read. She had not yet looked at the last envelope in the cedar box, the one that said, "For the child who will come after Dara." It sat at the bottom of the box under the 18 letters, and she had been aware of it since she first opened the bundle, and she had not been ready for it. The community gathering was set for December 23rd. Word spread through the networks that small communities maintained without needing formal announcement, the network of who knew whom and who had mentioned it to the right person. Flora wrote on a piece of paper, "Holiday gathering at Red Mesa Lodge. All welcome. Bring a memory, a song, or a story." She had it copied at the trading post and put in the post office and the grocery store and on the board at the chapter house. Holt said, "I've had 6 calls in 2 days from people who want to come." Ben said, "I've had more than that." Flora said, "The tree." They found a tree on the 4th day of December, a ponderosa pine, growing at the edge of the property line, tall and straight, and they cut it and brought it inside and stood it in the northeast corner of the main room where the sap stain on the floor showed it had stood before, and Calla directed the placement with the authority of someone who had been thinking about this for several days and had a clear vision of the correct result. They strung popcorn on thread. They cut paper stars. They found a box of old ornaments in the back of the storage shed, pressed cardboard and painted glass, and Calla handled each one as if they were things that had been through something and come out intact, which they had. She placed a small glass angel with a chipped wing at the very top of the tree. She stood back and looked at it. She said, "That's right." On December 22nd, Dara was in the records room reviewing the legal folder when she heard the truck on the drive. She went to the window. Holt's Ranger vehicle. She went out. He was standing by the driver's side door, holding a printed photograph. He said, "I put up a camera 3 days ago at the tree line eastern edge." He held out the photograph. She took it. The image was clear enough. A figure at the edge of the forest facing the lodge, standing in the particular way of someone who had been standing in that same spot for a while and had become comfortable there. The coat was the same canvas and wax she'd seen hanging on the nail in the storage shed. The face was turned toward the camera, but at an angle, the jaw and brow visible, the eyes catching the ambient light from the lodge windows. She looked at the face. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about the way a face was built, which was not something you chose, which arrived from somewhere else and declared itself through you without your input. The shape of a jaw, the line of a cheekbone, the set of eyes at a particular angle. She had been seeing these things in the mirror for 34 years without knowing where they came from. She was looking at them now from the outside in a printed photograph in the face of a man she had never met. She handed the photograph back to Holt. She said, "His name is Damon." Holt said, "Do you want me to go find him?" She thought about that. She thought about what it would mean to send someone to find him, to bring him to her, to convert an approach that was entirely his own into something managed and arranged. She thought about what the door being open meant. She said no. She said, "Leave the door open tonight." Holt looked at her. She said literally, during the gathering, "Leave the front door open. It gets warm enough in there to manage a draft. He'll see the light from wherever he is." Holt folded the photograph. He said, "All right." He said, "Dara." She looked at him. He said, "You sure?" She said, "I don't know, but I'm sure about the door." The gathering began at 7. The first trucks came down the drive before the light was fully gone, headlights swinging through the trees in long arcs, the crunch of tires on the packed snow of the drive carrying up to the porch where Dara and Kala stood watching them arrive. People came with children bundled in parkas and with casseroles wrapped in foil and with the careful expressions of people approaching a thing they had memories of and did not want to find diminished by the years. They stepped onto the porch and their faces changed because the lights were on, because the fire was going in the hearth, because through the tall south windows the room was warm and visible, and the tree was in the northeast corner where it had always stood with the glass angel at the top, and the quilts were on the furniture, and the pine bough smell was coming through the open door, and there was music starting somewhere inside because the door was open. They came in. They walked the main room the way people walked a place they had been trying to remember correctly for years, touching the woodwork, looking up at the chandelier which Holt had rewired enough to take 3 bulbs glowing now like something that had been cold for a long time and was receiving warmth for the first time, looking at the tree, looking at each other across the space. Someone said, "That's where we slept. 3rd room on the 2nd floor." Someone else said, "I remember that piano." A woman reached out and touched the stone hearth. She said, "He used to sit right here. He had a story for every night. He never told the same one twice. I don't know how he did that." Dara poured cider into mismatched mugs from the kitchen collection and handed them around and let the room fill. The room knew how to fill. It had been designed for this, built for the specific purpose of holding people together in the winter, and it remembered how. Flora came with Vera Tso and the other women from the chapter house and a bundle of sage and walked the rooms in the way she walked them quietly, purposefully, the smoke curling behind her into the corners and the rafters and the places where the ceiling met the walls, touching all the surfaces with something that was not quite a ceremony and not quite simply air. Ben arrived with the guitar and started something soft near the fire, old harmonies that people recognized in the body before the mind caught up the kind of music that had existed in a place long enough to become part of it. Calla was in the middle of everything, moving between the people with the ease of a child who understood that a room full of adults needed to be made to feel welcome, not the other way around. She was asking people their names and using them immediately and asking follow-up questions that demonstrated she'd retained the answers, which made each person feel heard in a specific way rather than in a general polite way. She had Nola's gift. Dara had not seen it clearly until this room full of people, but she saw it clearly now. She knew everyone's name after the first time she heard it. She remembered what mattered to them. She had a gift for making people feel that the place they were in was the right place for them to be. Stories went up on the walls. Flora had suggested it and provided the push pins and the index cards, and Dara had put the stack on the table near the bookshelf, and people had found them on their own and begun writing without being organized into it. A couple wrote about the Christmas they'd come here as newlyweds and gotten snowed in for 3 extra days, and how those 3 days were the best of their marriage, and how they'd been coming back to this mountain every December for 40 years to stand at the place where it happened. An elder wrote 3 lines in Dine Bizad and 1 line in English. Some places are not built, they are grown. A boy of about 10, the son of one of the women from the chapter house, wrote in large, careful letters, "This tree is taller than my house." Dara pinned them up as they came, adding each one to the growing layer. She was standing at the wall when she felt it. Not a sound. A change in the quality of the cold that came through the open front door, as if the cold had been organized differently, as if someone had stepped through it and displaced it in a particular way. She turned. A man in a wax canvas coat was standing on the porch, not inside, not quite outside, standing in the threshold in the way of someone who was making a decision about which way to go and had been making it for some time and had not yet resolved it. He was older than the camera photograph had suggested, or the photograph had not been capable of capturing the specific quality of what 30 years of a particular kind of caring looked like on a person. The face she had recognized in 2 dimensions was more complex in 3. There was something in it she could not name immediately. Not guilt exactly, not grief exactly. Something between those 2 things, the expression of a person who had been carrying something for a very long time and was not sure whether setting it down was something they were permitted to do. He looked at the room, he looked at the tree in the corner, he looked at the fire, then he looked at her. Dara stood at the wall with a pushpin in one hand and an index card in the other, and she looked back at him. She did not move toward him. She did not close the door. She turned back to the wall and pressed the pushpin through the index card and added it to the others and listened to the room. She heard Calla behind her. She heard Calla's voice, direct and unself-conscious. "Hi, I'm Calla. What's your name?" And then a pause, and then Calla again. "This was my grandmother's lodge. She built it, kind of. I'm gonna take care of it now." Dara turned. Calla was standing in front of the man in the wax canvas coat, with her hand out and her head slightly tilted, and the patience of a child who had learned that adults sometimes needed a moment to arrive at the moment. He looked at her hand, he looked at her face. He crouched down to her level, slowly, with the care of someone whose body had accumulated the evidence of years and was accounting for it. He needed a moment to fully understand what he was looking at. He shook her hand. Calla said, "Do you want some cider?" he said, and his voice was low and careful and measured. "Yes, thank you." She said, "I'll get you some. Don't go anywhere." She disappeared toward the kitchen. The man straightened slowly. He looked at Dara. She looked at him. Ben was playing something that was half song and half conversation near the fire, and the room was warm and full of people who had come back to a place they had loved and found it still standing. The tree was in the corner with the chipped angel at the top. The fire was going. The stories were on the wall. Dara said, "There's a place to sit by the fire." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "All right." He did not thank her. She did not want him to. This was not a gift she was giving, and it was not a debt she was settling. It was a door left open and a person walking through it, and those were separate from everything that had come before them. Calla returned with a mug, carrying it with both hands in the way she carried things that mattered with full attention. He took it. She said, "Is your coat warm enough? We have extra blankets if you need one." He looked at the mug in his hands, at the steam rising from it, at the fire across the room. He said, "I'm fine, thank you." She nodded satisfied and went back to the room. Dara watched her go. Then she went to find Flora. Flora was in the kitchen with Vera Tso and the other women. The cast iron skillet on the portable burner fry bread rising in the oil, in the way that it rose, the smell of it moving through the double doors into the main room and changing the air in a way that nothing else could. Flora looked up when Dara came in. Dara said, "He's here." Flora said, "I know." She said, "How does it feel?" Dara stood in the kitchen with the smell of fry bread around her, and she thought about that question seriously. She said, like something that's been out of balance for a long time. She paused. She said, "Not fixed, just less out of balance." Flora turned the bread. She said, "That's how it starts." After the bread was done and plated and carried out to the table, and after Ben found a new song, and after the elder from the chapter house told 3 stories in a row, while children sat at his feet with the particular attention of children who understood they were receiving something worth receiving, Dara slipped away from the gathering. She went upstairs. She went to the sealed room. She went because it was the right place to do what she was about to do, because she understood now that this room was where her mother had kept the most important things, and what she was about to open was the most important of those things. She sat on the floor with the cedar box in front of her. She opened it. The birthday letters were inside, back in order, tied with their ribbon. She lifted them out and set them aside. She reached into the bottom of the box. The envelope was there, heavier than its size, her mother's round handwriting on the front. "For the child who will come after Dara." She held it. She thought about her mother writing this, sitting somewhere in this lodge in the last years of her life, writing forward into a future that was even more uncertain than the one she'd written toward when she addressed the letters to Dara. First writing to Dara, who did not yet exist, then writing to the child who would come after Dara, who existed even less, who was 2 generations into a future her mother could not see. The audacity of it, the stubbornness of it, the love in it that did not know how to be practical and did not try. She opened the envelope. Inside, a single sheet, the handwriting slightly less controlled than the other letters, the hand of someone who was further into the illness when she wrote this, who was pressing against something that was pressing back. "I don't know your name. I don't know if your mother has told you about this place yet. I hope she has. I hope she brought you here and let you see it the way it was meant to be seen, which is full of people and warm and smelling of pine and food and smoke. If she has, I hope you ran to the sledding hill. I hope she let you take the red sled. It has my name on it. I rode it down that hill more times than I can count, and every single time it felt the same, which is to say, it felt like the mountain made you a gift of itself, and you were fast enough to receive it. I hope you went down the hill, and I hope you laughed the way the mountains made you. Because if you did, I was watching. I watch everything that happens in this place, and I always will. That is not something you need to be afraid of. It is simply the nature of things that love does not go where the body goes. It stays where it was given. I gave mine here, so I am here. You are mine even though I have not met you. That is how it works. You are mine because you came from mine. I want you to know that whatever you are carrying, whatever has made getting here hard, whatever the world has asked of you that it had no right to ask, you are allowed to set it down in this place. This place was built for that. Your grandmother. Dara lowered the letter. She looked at the window of the sealed room, the frost on the inside of the glass, the dark outside it. She stood. She went to the window and cleared a circle in the frost with her palm and looked out. The sledding slope ran down from the east side of the lodge property, packed smooth by Ben's equipment work earlier in the week, the lanterns lining the path, throwing small pools of amber light on the snow. At the top of the slope, beyond the nearest lantern, a small figure, Kala, standing at the top with the red sled. Dara pressed her palm flat against the cold glass. She watched her daughter position the sled at the top and sit down and kick off. She could not hear the laugh from here, through the glass and the sealed room and the cold between, but she knew what it sounded like. She had been hearing it for 7 years. She knew its exact quality, the specific way it rose, the sound her daughter made when she was purely inside a moment without anything else alongside it. She had heard it described once in a letter, like the mountains made you. She put her hand over her mouth. She stood in the sealed room in the attic of Red Mesa Lodge and watched her daughter get up from the bottom of the slope and throw her arms in the air and start pulling the sled back up. She stood there for a long time. She was not crying. Her eyes were very clear. Then she went downstairs. She went through the main room, through the gathering, still going with its songs and stories and the smell of fry bread and cider and fire, and she went out through the kitchen and around the side of the lodge to the edge of the slope. Kala was at the bottom, pulling the sled back up with the particular determination she brought to repetitive tasks she had decided were worthwhile. She looked up when she heard Dara coming. She said, "Did you see me?" Dara said, "I saw you." She said, "How fast was I?" Dara said, "Fast." Kala looked at the sled in her hands. She ran her thumb over the carved letters in the wood, the name in the wood. She said, "Did she really ride this?" Dara said, "She did, on this same hill." Kala looked up the slope. She said, "What was she like?" Dara thought about the photographs, about the laugh you could hear from outside if the windows were open, about a woman who wrote letters to people who did not exist yet because she believed enough in their eventual arrival to address them by name. She said she made people feel welcome. She remembered what mattered to them. She had a gift for it. Kala was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's what I want to be." She said it the way she said things she had decided, not as a wish, as a statement of intention. Dara looked at her daughter. She thought about a letter written to a child not yet born, about a grandmother watching from this hill for 30 years, about the mountain and the snow and the lodge behind them with its lights in the windows and the sound of music and voices coming through the open door. She said, "You already are." Kala looked at the slope. She said, "One more run." She pulled the sled to the top and went down again, and the laugh came back up the hill to where Dara was standing, and it was exactly the sound her mother had written down 30 years before her daughter existed. Exactly that sound. Dara stood at the edge of the slope and listened to it fade into the cold night air. She stayed there until Kala decided she was done. They went back inside together. The gathering wound down slowly, the way gatherings wound down when they had been good. People found reasons to stay a few more minutes, finishing the last of the cider, having the conversation they'd been putting off, saying the thing they'd been waiting to say. By 10 o'clock, the fire had burned to steady coals, and most of the guests had gone, and only the inner circle remained, Holt and Ben and Flora and Vera Tso, and they cleaned up in the comfortable silence of people who had been through something together. The man in the wax canvas coat was gone. She did not know when he had left. She had not watched him go. Flora said at the door, "He'll come back." Dara said, "I know." She said, "When he's ready." Flora said, "Or when you are." Dara looked at her. Flora said, "Both things have to be true." She went out. Holt was the last to leave. He stood at the door and looked at the main room. The fire coals, the tree, the stories pinned on the wall, the quilts on the furniture. He said Elias would have loved this. Dara said, "Yeah." He said, "It's good to be back." He went out. Kala was asleep in the room at the end of the second-floor hall before Dara finished locking up. She'd pulled the blanket to her chin and put one arm around the carved wooden horse from the attic room that she had adopted in the first week without asking and without anyone suggesting it was not hers to take, and which now lived on the nightstand beside her. Dara stood in the doorway and looked at her daughter. She thought about letters written in the dark to people not yet born, about what it meant to believe in someone's eventual arrival so completely that you addressed them before they existed. She thought about what she would write someday, not tonight, but someday. When she found the words, she went to her own room. She lay in the dark and listened to the lodge settle into the cold of the night, the beams and the boards doing what old wood did in the cold, speaking in the language of things that had been here for a long time and expected to remain. She slept. In the morning, the valley was white with new snow, and the sky had the particular clarity that came after a storm had passed, as if the air had been washed clean of everything that had been accumulating in it. She made coffee and stood at the south windows and watched the light come up over the ridge, slow and gold, touching the snow-covered pines one row at a time from the highest elevations down. She put on her coat. She went out to the porch. On the top step, placed with care, a pair of children's gloves, small, knitted in a deep red, new, the kind of new that spoke of recently purchased rather than long stored, placed on the step with precision, not dropped, not left accidentally. She picked them up. No note, no envelope, nothing explaining them. She held them in both hands. She looked toward the tree line. The snow was undisturbed along the eastern edge. No tracks visible from here, but the snow had fallen through the night and covered everything and proved nothing. She stood on the porch with the gloves in her hands. She thought about what she owed him. She thought about what he owed her. She thought about the math of loss and absence, the 30 years of it, and whether that math could ever arrive at a number that felt like something other than itself. She thought about the door she had left open. She thought about a man who had come in and sat by the fire and had accepted a mug of cider from a 7-year-old who did not know who he was and had immediately tried to make sure he had enough of what he needed, and who had said thank you in the low, careful voice of someone saying it and meaning it. She thought about the gloves, which were sized for a child he had not met, which meant someone had told him the size. Flora. She put the gloves in her coat pocket. She would give them to Kala at breakfast. She would say someone left these on the step. She would not say more than that. Not yet. There was a time for that story, and she would know it when she was in it. Some things needed to be held before they could be told. She stood on the porch and looked out at the valley. The smoke from the chimney behind her was rising straight up in the cold, still air, visible against the pale sky, marking the place the way smoke had always marked places where there was warmth inside, a signal visible from a distance, saying here, someone choosing to be here. She put her hand on the post at the corner of the porch. The wood was cold under her palm and worn smooth by every hand that had stood here before her. Elias, his father before that, Nola standing on a porch in a photograph with the valley behind her, looking at something off to the right of the frame with an expression that lived between a smile and something more private. Dara stood at the corner of the porch and felt the cold and the wood and the solidity of a thing that had been built to hold weight and had held it. She looked down at the valley. She looked at the sledding slope smooth and white from last night and from Kala's runs and from the new snow over all of it. She looked at the tree line. She looked at the mountain. She put both hands on the railing. She stayed,